there.
The biggest issues to,
An email. It's
sooner or later again.
Yeah, let's compare.
I asked,
You mean the original or the?
order since we have a quorum now and we have a good bit of work to do. Thank you for your patience, everybody. Thank you for being here. First item on the, let's see, we have Patrick still to come, right?
You reported being late.
Scott will be absent.
GR reported an absence as well.
Okay. Our first order of the meeting is to approve the minutes of the April 30th, 2018 meeting. Do you all need a couple of minutes to look over this?
One thing I noticed is that April, it says April 16 on the packet instead of the 30th.
On this meeting notes.
Did you get that? Okay.
Thank you.
I would move that we approve the minutes from the 30th with the change
Karen
of date.
moved. And second, it's been moved and seconded. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. These next two items, number 2 and 3, we're gonna receive these correspondences and then save the discussion for, our fourth item. So, here a motion to receive Commissioner Louise' correspondence.
So moved.
I'll second that. Moved and seconded, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
And, motion to receive the correspondence from the Lawrence Board of Realtors.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. All right, Scott, do you want to talk us through, the bulk of our work here on this item?
Yeah, so we're excited and proud to present this draft, which is what I think the third iteration of the plan, since we got a plan established last year. I wanted to start off with what you're seeing on the screen here, which is the data on this draft itself, just to let you see that each time you've put us to work on revising per your comments and your direction, we are able to record and track that work. So what we had here with this, since the February draft, is 381 total changes, with 190-ish replacements, 112 insertions, and 74 deletions. And we can talk more about what all that meant, because I'm hoping that you'll find that we're accommodating all of the intentions that the majority consensus of the commission has provided us in terms of direction, because that's how we take direction, is through majority consensus of this steering committee. And so you have, with today's correspondence, about 4 years worth of public process and correspondence and letters, and I think you've been kind of reviewing and integrating those as we've been going through the process, so you may want to look at what you have before you on today's agenda as well. And then we can go through and just talk about some of the highlights of what we've heard at the last meeting and what changes were made. We can look at specific policies if you like, because each time I think it's really evolved the plan into something that is very good for Lawrence and Douglas County as a community and a set of communities. From this point today, if we can garner a motion to move this out of the steering committee, then our plan is to work to get a joint planning commission, city commission, county commission meeting together, may even entertain a school district, because they're an important component of land use in partnering in the district, and there's some model of that kind of meeting anyway that we've used in the past. So we're going to work with the city manager's office and county administration and perhaps the school district to establish a meeting. The intent of that meeting would be to get all of the decision makers, or most of the decision makers, in the room to hear the kickoff presentation and the highlights of what's changing from Horizon 2020 to Plan 2040. And then from there, we would begin our scheduling of the actual formal comprehensive plan amendment, which is an actual type of application we use in the planning office to get comprehensive plan amendments approved. And that would start with the planning commission and then work its way to both governing bodies. And as I've advised before, to be effective for everyone, all three of those bodies need to approve the comprehensive plan. And so with that, I would receive questions, or if you want me to keep going on kind of major revisions and what we've done here, we can talk about that, or you can decide how to proceed at your own choosing.
Well, I know we need to talk about Karen's suggestions as kind of some text narrative and text amendments or additions to the language that we already have. It came up as a kind of this ongoing concern that we've talked about, realizing some of the gaps in language around agriculture, the unincorporated areas of Douglas County. And I can say for the county, we've seen some activity lately out in the county that has been concerning in terms of increased activity in housing development, even some subdivision interest and all of that. So I find that this language is important and helpful for county concerns, and I'm grateful Karen worked with our zoning and codes planner, and I think worked out some good additional language. This group needs to decide if there's a willingness to go ahead and have this language, have staff add this language into the draft that then will go out to the public for the public's comment. The other way to go would be to just wait until it comes before the Planning Commission and have Karen bring it up as a recommended addition to the language. So in my view, I think it'd be nice for the public to see it as part of the draft, but I'll let you all. And Karen, you maybe want to walk us through what you've done.
And I'd also say for context that I'm comfortable with either process. It doesn't have to be something that this group pushes forward. It can come, if this group decides that it's better for it to go through the public process and the planning commission part of it, that's fine too. There's nothing in here that, it would hold me up from moving this forward. I think it's a very great document and ready for the great discussion that I'm sure it's going to have at all three of our bodies. So yeah, I did meet with Tanya Voigt and Helen Schnoes, and we worked through a little bit of language. There's nothing that's particularly major, I don't think. And in reading through the next draft, this current draft, and comparing that, I think many of these suggestions would still fit. And then we ran it by Nancy just to kind of have her eyes on it also. And you all have it in front of you. In the introduction, the community vision, and I just pulled this straight from Mary Miller's comments. I did not try and draft something of my own. At the time, I actually thought that this would just go to staff and they would digest it and kind of make it fit with whatever was there, as opposed to me bringing in a quotation exactly. Just to make sure that vision statement really does incorporate county and city kind of in equal measures. And part of that comes from we had a seminar talking about comprehensive plans. We read one for another community as a group, and how much of an unknown community you should be able to look through their comprehensive plan and really understand what their community is made of. And I feel like that an addition to our vision of a more rural look also, or a sentence or so, would also really help that to echo who we are. Ditto with in the introduction about the live, work, play, something about some of our play kind of opportunities that are out in the county, just in addition with that. Most of my comments were in the Chapter 2, Growth and Development, because that's where we really talk about rural housing. And when we go to these tiers of development, because we're trying to encourage infill and density in the city and around the city, the flip side of that is that the purpose is to not encourage a lot of outside of agricultural housing development in the county. We have a lot of that that's going to happen just because that's the way it's set up right now, and it's kind of grandfathered in, but I think there's a real will at the county and its zoning and codes to make sure that this document really, kind of thoroughly makes us look hard at rural housing. So there are just some adding compatible uses. So there's in the first vision under growth management that we have accommodating basically demands for other uses in the county, but to make sure that those are compatible with the rural character. Let's see. We have one, we can scroll through all of them. I'm just not sure how much time you want to spend with it or how much time anybody has spent with it. But there's something about maintaining the development patterns that we have, whether or not those development patterns are deemed to be appropriate now. So changing that to say rather that we would identify and adopt appropriate land divisions and development patterns. The 1.5 there, it talks about requiring cluster development, and we want to specify that's between in tier 2 and 3, not that the whole county we're going to encourage large developments so long as they cluster, just to make sure that that's and I think that was the intent, it just spells it out. And then 1.6 and 1.7 were new items, and just to reiterate, maintaining working lands and prime soils, and to reclassify the rural zoning to align with the current use. That's actually underway, and it's just making sure that the document that we propose has room for what's already happening currently at county zoning and codes. They're working on that to make sure that we support their work.
So these are adding 1.6 and 1.7?
Those are additional ones, yes, those are new. Under residential, let's see. Again, it's ensuring a variety of housing options, but we want to make sure that those housing options that we are ensuring in the rural areas are beneficial for rural communities and agriculture. And within the vision, I call that 1.0, that's before we have these bullet points underneath it. Minimizing non-agricultural residential development outside the UGA. It's just really stating that that's what we're up to. Whether people are comfortable with that statement, I think that's the direction that we've been trying to head with the whole document.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
About that? For the UGA, I was looking at the growth tiers, and I was kind of curious if it's, so they're not consistent, like the urban growth area and the tiers. I saw that there's like north of town, kind of in near the Santa Fe Industrial Park, I guess what it's called. That's part of the urban growth area, but it's not considered tier 2. And I guess I was left puzzled by, is the urban growth area being changed to conform to the tier 2, or is there still this?
I think there is some
expectation to
changes
grow?
that we're gonna do with the urban growth area. For example, we had not followed up with the Grant Township sector plan item since it's been adopted. But that's okay, we don't get a whole lot of requests, they know our position up there. But, so I'll let Jeff answer this specific question about tiers versus the UGA though.
The UGA is not changing as it is. That line would still stay the same. The tiers are modifying inside of the UGA based on the Northeast Area Plan, floodplain movement, some other things that have gone on there that were part of the exclusion for the tiers, like don't build in the water and details like that. But no, it would not change the UGA. That's the standard shape that starts the tiers.
we pare down the UGA, we pare that down for access to fire services, floodplain, all those kinds of things.
Correct.
By default,
We
it's
pared
always
down
gonna
the
be
tiers,
smaller.
not the UGA.
Right.
The
Start with
UGAs
UGA,
had
it's smaller.
even longer vision and longer planning timeline.
But I want to make sure I understand you, because it has been years since we've been saying that the UGA boundary would change up in the Grant Township area. Will the maps
The maps will reflect that. I'm trying to
reflect that?
find
Fine. Okay.
And if they don't, if we've missed that component, it is an important one because it is what links in our subjoint subdivision regulations, the ability to do cluster development in the UGA.
And actually, I think it's really particularly important because there is some requested activity.
I think our intention is to modify it in Grant Township as we've committed to doing. And probably the reason we haven't is because we knew this was in process.
Yeah.
And, or coming. And then maintain the UGA. Yeah.
So if,
So that's our proposal, right, Jeff? Which is a modified Grant Township and maintaining the rest of it.
can you add the UGA on that map?
No. Don't believe I can.
The current one?
Yeah, like,
Essentially with this, the outer edge of tier 3 is the UGA.
Right, is that your
Right.
question?
yeah,
Right, the outer edge of, so the only place we're modifying the UGA is in Grant Township. The rest of it is maintained at its current boundary, and that's the boundary of Tier 3.
So tier
So
3
tier-
is the UGA.
Tier 2 lies within.
Okay.
The only caveat to that, there are a couple places where tier 1 touches the outer edge. So tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 make up the UGA.
Yeah, okay.
And for the most part, tier 3 is the outer boundary. There are some small exceptions to that, such as the airport.
Thank you, that graphic helps.
Okay. Good question, Charlie. Thanks.
sorry.
It's okay. I think the last bit under residential, it's all just kind of reiterating that we're not always happy with the existing residential development regulations in the county, that they're already working to change some of those, and this document should reflect that. So that's the main, strike maintain existing and put in revise and develop new. The county, the zoning and codes was on board with that. Requiring tier 3 to cluster, I changed the wording around basically that it, so it didn't sound like we were encouraging cluster developments outside of the tier 3. And the 4.3 under the sector plans, or sorry, under preserving sensitive lands through site planning, plating, and design. And actually this came from Jeff at another meeting, that sector plans could maybe be added to that as a really strong tool for protecting sensitive lands, just to make sure that that's in there. Also on the list, that as we revise those, we pay attention to the sensitive lands. And then the chapter 3 and 7, the chapter 3, when I first read through that and said, you know, this doesn't have anything to do with rural housing, and it doesn't need to. So I just thought if we could call that chapter, relabel it either urban neighborhoods and housing or Lawrence neighborhoods and housing, something like that, then we just know that all of the rural residential is in chapter 2. And that would be a great clarification, I think, for the document. And then chapter 7, under community resources, wanted to have adopt an agricultural preservation plan for working lands. And that's something that came out of, or has been talked about, but certainly came out of the ag preservation meeting that Helen organized, and we had some out-of-town people come in, and Nancy and Jeff were present for that. That's something that's kind of underway, and I'd like to see that in there as something that we are working towards. And that was all of the comments that I had, they can either be discussed at this level or passed to the next.
Well, I think they really should be something that, like your other correspondence that you've grappled with and debated and discussed, I think it's right to do the same with the correspondence you have today. I can tell you that we've looked at it, and I think they're very complimentary comments to the plan we have. They bolster things that we want to do with it. The vision is always kind of touchy because we worked really hard early on that vision, but I guess I reviewed all these comments to the plan itself, and I can see it the way you're reading it, where, okay, this is lacking here. Now that we've evolved some of these things over time and started talking about them and their intentions, I think they're complementary. I agree with the neighborhoods and housing. I looked through there to say, come on, we gotta have a rural policy in here somewhere. There just isn't. It's all
Yeah.
about Lawrence.
Mhm.
So it does make sense to have that retitled and so forth. So I guess what I'm saying is, from staff's perspective, we can work with this and might minor tweak some of the stuff if you give us that ability. But
Definitely.
I would recommend that if you accept it, we put it in and put it out to the as the new draft plan.
Karen, I'm curious if you, I've recently discovered there are municipalities that are taking the radical steps of,
Speak up a little bit.
sorry, there are municipalities that are de-annexing,
Mm-hmm.
you know, kind of the issues that we've talked about, sprawl, you know, coming under the guise of city maintenance. Cities are starting to de-annex areas. Have you heard of that? And does that relate to what you're proposing here, or can that provide some benefit to what you're proposing?
I have heard of it. I'm not well versed in it, but I think those are smaller communities that can no longer afford to maintain the
Mhm.
kind of city services, especially road maintenance.
Mhm.
So I don't think that's a place that we are in Lawrence or Douglas
Our
County.
communities I've been reading about are north of 150,000 people,
Mhm.
so I just thought it was interesting.
Mhm. I wouldn't know enough
Okay.
about it really to put it in that context.
Are they incorporating them afterwards as a separate municipality?
As I understand it, and I'm just reading about it, it's going back to county. So, no, they're not incorporating. And then, this talks about essentially bolstering the preservation of that rural land, particularly for agriculture. That creates pressure on particularly Tier 1. Do you have thoughts on if we're gonna further restrict development as we add 20, 30,000 people on the edges? How that relates to what we've suggested in chapter 3, to be able to handle that
Well,
development?
I think it's always cheaper to house people in more density, and that's something that you've
Yeah.
talked about also, and that they then are, you know, the city then can afford to provide services for them. The county really struggles with all of these, the houses that are built up in the county.
Yeah.
They all want their roads paved, you can't pay for that, and that, you know, so struggling to get services to the increasing number of people in the county that really don't bring enough of a tax dollar there to make that, to bring us to that next level. So I think that dollar for dollar, putting people in density, you know, in the city is a better bet. Also from the rural perspective, that to maintain a rural community, you need people that are willing to invest in a rural community when they move out there. And that's typically not who you get on the 3 to 5 acre parcels. They move out there because they think they're living in the boonies.
Right.
As opposed to moving to somebody else's community and they act like it. So that's been a struggle, you know, in terms of maintaining a rural community. They don't all have to be involved in agriculture, but they, you know, it's helpful if more people are involved in community.
What parcel size would you say is kind of weeds out those, I wouldn't even call homage, it's almost like a lifestyle choice?
Well, and sadly, you really can't really put a number on it, because people can do full-scale agriculture on an acre if they're,
Right.
you know, depending on what kind they're doing.
Right.
But typically you get just large yards, people who still want to water them and fertilize them and mow them and,
Right. Which is great for riding lawnmower companies.
yes. Yeah.
Okay.
I think what I'm hearing from our folks in zoning and codes is that we just need to find some balance of the, I mean, we're feeling the pressure from the city side of people who are finding it expensive and difficult to find their housing in the city, and the county's pretty easy to go out and get a parcel and build, and so that folks who wouldn't necessarily have chosen to build a home in the countryside just find that it's easier. So we need to strike a balance of, you know, the pressure that there is in the city side, and kind of, we need to pull our socks up on the county side to make sure that we, if there's going to be housing development, that it's appropriate to a rural area, and that it's set up for future services, you know, as the community grows. But to try and, you know, strike that balance is, you know, that
It's a
we're,
struggle.
yeah, we're just feeling some pressure that we haven't, is kind of popping up in ways that are concerning, so.
And I would suggest the demographic data and the economic data that I'm seeing is it's going to accelerate over the next 20 years. We've got 82 million millennials starting to form households. So my concern, I agree with almost everything. I can suggest that I'm okay with almost everything here. Save, I don't know if I can speak for the group. I can't speak for the group. I'm a little concerned about the community vision just because of the work that's been done there. Everything underneath that, I don't take exception to. My concern is we're putting even more pressure on urban neighborhoods, but the tools are not in here to create those
John,
units.
To
So-
clarify, you're proposing outside of the urban growth area to minimize that non-ag housing, right? Not in the growth area,
Right, I wasn't
putting
even
pressure on.
No, I understand.
tackling tier 3 even,
Yeah.
figured that is within the urban growth area, and that's where it's appropriate, for the appropriate kind of housing that will allow for future services, but outside of that was kind of the focus of my work.
I have a question about, the,
Can you all hear out there? I feel like we're, isn't it?
okay,
Yeah.
The mic's on.
It doesn't seem like the mic is
Are
working.
we
We're all
amplified?
speaking
We're
really
not
quiet,
close enough,
so,
Are we amplified? Yeah.
I guess get right up to it.
There's one down there. I have a question about the definition of rural character, and whether you feel like that is defined in the plan now. Because it's talked about in the community vision that you've written here, and then under 1.3 as well. This is a document that will be interpreted by many different groups, and would they understand what they're going for?
It's probably not really defined, and you probably have brought my own definition to it as I read it, as did probably everybody else. So yeah, that probably is something that maybe could be strengthened to have some idea what we're talking about, or be on the same page with what we talk about with rural character.
I just wondered if it was, I mean, you mentioned many things in the vision statement, but then have as well, so I wasn't sure what other aspects you were thinking about. Yeah.
Right.
And you really do have some competing interests, right,
Yes.
in the county areas. You've got those who would see rural as give me my 5 acres and my horse barn, or not even a horse barn, and you've got those who are agricultural minded in different capacities. And so which definition, which vision of rural are we seeking? I think a little bit of both, but it's that balance that Nancy talked about. Losing agricultural land is not always good for an agricultural-based county. And so I think what this sets up at the 30,000 foot mark, right, is policies that make us pay attention to that and do what we can to try to change that balance if it's not in balance now. I would be careful. I think the vision was worked on with that in mind, or at least these comments kind of help clarify the rural vision a little bit more than what maybe the vision talks about now. But defining it to the side, like we've defined so many things more specifically, I don't know what that necessarily might bring to the document.
You mean in terms of defining rural character
Right.
to the side, yeah.
Right.
And you're right, there'd be a lot of competing interests that would come to that, so.
Yep, some people think it's a ATV track that you can't do in the city.
Well, I can speak as someone who worked on that vision statement, that we really struggled to try and get everything in there that had to be in there, to push all the right buttons, to be, it couldn't be soaring rhetoric, it turned out. It had to be kind of just planning, but needed to be, you know, at least show all of the, you know, assets that we have that we do need to plan around. So I don't mind having additional language added that strengthens the county's side of the equation in terms of the you know, making it clear that we do have an important agricultural aspect to our to Douglas County. So I certainly wouldn't take offense at trying to at strengthening the vision and incorporating some of that language. I don't know if you.
I think adding more words to a vision statement makes it a little clunkier. In this case, though, I think the benefit far outweighs that this really does clarify and bring to life the vision that we do have for the unincorporated area. So I'm in favor of adding this language.
I've got no problem with adding it. However, I would caveat in any verbal kickoff with the planning and governing bodies that this was an addition to the vision statement in July of 2018 and probably did not go through all the vetting that the remainder of the vision statement did. So that would kind of open the door
Fair enough, yeah.
to encourage looking at things like plural character.
And I guess that's why I'm not comfortable with it, because I don't feel like the work has been done to vet it. Although in reading it, the only exception I really take to it is the term rural neighborhood. I'm not sure what that is. And it's antithetical to what you're saying about chapter 3, the idea of a neighborhood.
Well, all right, yeah, the idea of a rural neighborhood is very different from,
Yeah.
and that's why I kind of liked when it ended up being not in the chapter on
Yeah.
neighborhoods and housing,
Right.
because even though, and I use the term quite a lot to talk about where I live as a neighborhood, but it certainly looks very different than an urban neighborhood.
Well, I think
But-
village is far more appropriate.
And
As a
village is a word that's being used quite a bit more,
Yeah.
actually, so.
It's not used in
though-
this country as much as it should be.
Though, you know, a village could just as easily be, you know, like the town side of Warden or something like that, which
Yep.
doesn't really define the neighborhood as far as how it functions. But, you know, in terms of the language in that vision statement, I'm not married to any of that in particular. My hope was that kind of it would be, you know, washed through the filters at staff, you know, and kind of do some word crafting to see what fits there. But the idea was just to make sure that we didn't leave out some of the county perspective in that vision too. And I wasn't privy to all of the process that vision statement has gone through, so it's easy for me to say, well, we can just add this.
The villages mean unincorporated, is that right? Those are
The
the
village. Yeah, I think
unincorporated.
that is the way it's used.
Why don't we use the word township?
We
I'm
might-
thinking
we
about
might.
our community, I hear people talk about
That's,
which
that's
township.
that's a bigger,
It's a-
area, yeah.
It's an actual government and
Yeah.
it's geography, it's a boundaried area, Grant Township, Palmyra Township, Wakarusa Township.
So are they,
And those aren't
Like Warden would be within a township.
population centers, those are geographic.
It'd be a confusing word to use because of its relationship to that.
I'm certainly comfortable with the word village. People are not.
I've just heard
comfortable
people
with
that talk
neighborhood.
about they live in,
Such and such
You know.
township.
yeah, so it seems like,
Mhm.
I've never heard anybody talk about village, or they live in a
Yeah.
village in the county.
No, it's
So that seems like a different,
not part of the colloquial
right.
speech,
We would
but
seek out maybe the most appropriate term. Maybe
Yeah.
there's a state statute that defines what that is. We hear a lot of town of, but
Mhm.
a little bit of village. we can
So I
work
guess
on.
I wanna make sure we have plenty of time for, the Board of Realtors conversation and everything else. Are there any other comments or concerns? Do we wanna
Maybe Hamlet?
make a, Would anyone like to make a motion about adding, directing staff to, add, this new language, to the draft, which would then be available to the public to comment on it in the public meetings?
I would move to do so with the caveat that Bill described about a note saying that this was added more recently, and also a note to staff to check on whether rural character is defined in some way, if possible, just because the interpretation is so broad.
Do you want a definition for rural character?
Pardon me?
Do you want a definition for rural character?
I don't know. It-
Only if we like it.
Let's not wrestle with it.
It's just, it's, as you know, the comprehensive plan can be interpreted any number of ways, and it just leaves us open to, I suppose, some good discussion.
Yeah, I would come up with a hip pocket definition of it.
I guess my
And that would
point,
spark the discussion you're talking about,
Mhm.
and let the governing bodies and planning commission come to some level of comfort with how they see that. Because they're the ones who are gonna have to implement.
and my point was this new paragraph in the vision does a pretty good job of laying out what we mean without putting it in a definition on the sidebar. It's like we don't define urban, I don't think. Does that make sense? Without this language, I could see that as maybe,
Okay.
that's just my opinion, because it leaves a little bit up to people's position and perspective
Mhm.
versus, but there's enough language about the agricultural economy and the thriving farms and, those kinds of things that give one a sense of what we mean. We don't mean high retail centers and, high-rise buildings and different stuff. And some counties, some areas do have that in their
Okay.
unincorporated areas, frankly, so.
Mhm.
But that's just,
Okay,
that's my
I-
opinion.
I'm good with that.
Okay, so
You made a motion.
So yes, so my motion, just to repeat it, is to approve the changes here with the caveat of making a note that the vision is being added to the current vision later in the process.
Just to clarify, that just the vision was changed at
No,
the
the
later
whole-
date?
Oh, all these changes came later, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
A second.
All right. Any further discussion? It's been moved and seconded. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And Karen, thank you so much for you and Tanya and for doing all that homework. I appreciate it. So now we have a conversation about the correspondence concern from the Board of Realtors. Scott, do you want to, this is a topic that's been had here for a while. It's also popped up in the affordable housing
Yeah,
advisory board.
I'll speak generally about it. I don't want to speak for the Board of Realtors. They've given you some specific communications. I imagine they will get very much more involved once it gets to the Planning Commission and governing bodies. But I would imagine that one of the issues that the Planning Commission and governing bodies are going to be presented with are the issues around our annexation policies. One of the things that came out of the public process was better managing of our growth. And growth is one of the key reasons we have a comprehensive plan, right? How to accommodate the next anticipated wave of residents in the county and in the city of Lawrence. And so as our plan evolved, we looked at kind of current conditions and what our needs are as a community and how all that works as development, as growth happens in the community. And I guess our finding was that the current way of doing things needed maybe a little bit of a change. We're not necessarily getting the full outcome of what we expect out of development. Sure, development, and I'm gonna point to, if Jeff or Amy can get up, on page 13 of the comp plan, just to let you see what the perspective of the plan is. Because we have talked a lot about this, but I think there are some organizations that are going to view this as their organization or their industry shouldering a lot of the burden of developing in the city. And the city already has development policies that put the burden of development financially on development itself. And on page 13, it's where the pig is, Jeff. The page with
Page with the
the
page.
little pig.
Now?
I don't, digital page, is there a digital page? Yeah, there we go, okay. And then, so, maybe zoom in on the proposed annexation paragraph right there. It talks about, while growth generally is considered to be good because it expands the tax base, accommodates an increasing population, and involves more people in the political process, it can have financial implications for the communities. And it's that last part, it can have financial implications, providing and maintaining infrastructure and services to the new area to place an additional burden on existing residents. And so we talk about balance of things, right? We're trying to balance this issue as well in this plan. And so what we have put forth in our draft to you, and the draft that survived a couple of editions now, is sort of a two-prong approach to annexations. One, is there a need for the annexation? And when we talk about the need, the growth is going to give us either residential, commercial, or industrial, or a mix of those kinds of uses. Does the city of Lawrence, in this example, do we need new land to accommodate one of those uses? And then you can break that down further into the type of residential, for example. Do we need single-family lot? Do we need multi-dwelling inventory area? So that's sort of questions that go with the need. Do we need to grow, or can we accommodate it in the existing city limits? And I would expand that to even, can we accommodate growth in areas that we've already planned infrastructure in and have sat idle for a number of years? Because there are areas just outside of the city that are capable of providing services because they have been built years and years ago. They just haven't been put to use yet. Then there's the community benefit issue. And so we've had a great deal of discussion in the last several years even on needs that the community has that partners in the development community may be able to help us with. Affordable housing, land for other governmental services, land for education, different ways that they can partner in that to get at all of the unmet needs that the community seems to have. So we have put forth a proposal that when an annexation is presented, that we look at need and benefit, and it's a bit of a discussion about how a proposal is doing that, because we believe that growing the community should be good for all parties involved, not just one or two. All parties need to benefit from growing a community. It's a very serious thing to expand the community boundaries from our perspective. So the letter from the Board of Realtors, of course, kind of focuses in on that issue and urges us to consider a different policy. In my discussions with them, they're not seeking unfettered growth, sprawl, or anything like that, but they are concerned that having to prove need and provide community benefit, as we've outlined community benefit, is going to actually restrict the market versus aid the market. And we believe that there's a balance there, that we can accomplish good growth, managed growth, and talk about community benefits that are provided as well. Now, what may be missing in my mind is I've read through very seriously the Board of Realtors letter and our own policies. My question to the group is, it was never meant to put burden on any one industry or sector to say, you provide everything and we'll just, get all the benefit out of it. So perhaps that collaboration between partners may be missing in the policy statement. That may be something you direct us to work on a little bit, because when you think about specific examples, say you get an annexation for 100 acres, and we think that maybe that's an opportunity to provide affordable housing, and we have the Affordable Housing Trust Fund that we may have some room to work with. So maybe, or any number of ideas for waiving fees or property tax issues or there are a lot of ideas out there that we need to develop, I think, to get a partnership to address community need and not just put it on one industry or sector of the community. So I hope that all makes sense. That's the best I can make of the comments from the Board of Realtors. Again, it's not your practice to take comment at the podium, but I do think that this is going to be an ongoing discussion as this gets out to the public.
I would think that'll be a conversation, I'm not even sure that's a conversation the planning commission can have, as much as really the community benefits related to annexation and new housing are really tied to the city commission and new
3.8.
policies there.
So if you go to
So how you have
3.8 on the next page, you'll see we've tried to put a little meat on the bones in terms of how annexation requests would be processed. After we get through the need discussion, we would talk about identifying the community benefit or benefits provided, be considered by the planning commission, approved by the city commission, and implemented through an annexation agreement. So that's how we see the process unfolding as future annexations come into it. And remember, annexations are requested by an owner. The city's not forcing in the way we practice this. So we're not mandating they come into the city. They're asking for services, so they're asking for something.
I guess my comment is more, it's almost a philosophical, like the collaboration versus kind of mandatory is.
We're proposing more of a carrot. We're proposing more of a carrot than a stick. Is what we're proposing.
What is the proposal specifically?
Well, the comp plan proposal is this idea that, and each annexation ends up being a little bit different, so that each one of them might bring a different community benefit to the discussion. And it depends a lot on the scope of an annexation. An annexation of hundreds of acres is much different than a 5-acre annexation and a single-use kind of annexation. And so there may be a development that has the ability to help out with parkland or land for a school site and get the USD involved, whichever one it happens to be, because we're a multi-school county. And so each one may be a little bit different, and we're not exactly sure what that looks like in terms of the policy, but we're trying to establish the umbrella policy to give us that ability to have those talks.
Can I ask, the Affordable Housing Committee is still meeting and forming a plan. So isn't this more appropriate to go to that as that's being established, rather than to the comp plan at the moment?
I think it works well with it, because all the comp plan is saying is that providing affordable housing is a need. It's a community benefit that you can provide. It doesn't go further than that. It doesn't talk about details. It doesn't set up a framework for how that's done. And at this level in the plan, I think that's appropriate. We have other policies in the plan under affordable housing categories that talk about including the Affordable Housing Board's plan as if it were in the comp plan.
Because this document is refuting an idea of requiring 10 to 30% of new development be affordable, but that's not a proposal that's really been put forward. So it's refuting something that doesn't exist yet.
I think it's by example, right?
Okay,
It's-
so that it really probably needs to go then to the Affordable Housing Committee to have them grapple with that. Because certainly they make some good points that if if that were the requirement, which we don't have that requirement yet, then there would be some real economic problems with making that happen, but
Right, now we're likely to get out of the Affordable Housing Board from here into the future, several policy changes that can affect development. It's about all we talk about, right, is how do we affect development to get more or financing, or on the income side, more income, more jobs. So, that's a very complex issue, and we're not trying to solve that with this. We are saying that if a development can come and provide a community benefit, and it doesn't have to be affordable housing, it could be additional sensitive lands, for example. It can be parks, it can be donations, or I say donations, but ways to help a school district, or utilities land a site for a water tower, or, I don't know all the different things that the community will need for the next 20 years, but I do know I'd like to have the discussions as the community grows and how we can partner with entities to try to get to those needs. That's the point of the comprehensive plan policy.
well, I'd be very comfortable if we say we received this document and discussed it and referred it to the Affordable Housing Committee for their further discussion, and then just made a note that we recognize that in this document, affordable housing is only one of many community benefits that we would like to be looking for, and a concrete plan has not yet been put forward. That would be how I would react to the
I think
document.
we're happy to provide this to the Affordable Housing Board. I think that the board and the public can expect to have ongoing discussions throughout the near and long term about different policies that could affect zoning issues. We're working on a number of things. But I mean, the point I wanted to make is that our intention isn't to restrict development. We fully recognize that. I'm the biggest cheerleader we have right now that says we're getting kind of low on single lot inventory. We need to do something to pick it up. What that is and how that is, where that is, are the questions that maybe remain.
Were you looking for some direction in terms of creating more collaborative language, or do you want that to just come naturally out of the conversations that in the
But-
public meetings?
I think I would ask the group, your understanding of what we're trying to do with this community benefits, and in the light of the letter that you'll see, that you've seen, and maybe one or two others like it, do you think we're at a good place in the plan in terms of, does it read as if they're not out there shouldering the burden on their own, but we anticipate collaboration and partnerships as we go through the exercise of seeking community benefits? I would argue it probably doesn't go far enough right now, that it could go farther in that regard with another policy or two in this same section.
You say it could go farther.
I think we could put some language in there that reflects a greater sense of collaborating with development community
Partnerships.
on these issues.
Scott, I'm kind of curious, I was going through the plan to see where it mentions the use of incentives, because they had listed out some possible incentives. And there are several instances where incentives are suggested in the plan. One is to preserve woodlands, another is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to increase the use of green building practices, to encourage adaptive reuse of historic structures, and to conserve historically significant farmlands and structures. So there are several cases where there's some notion of an incentive policy. And in previous conversations at this table, it seems like we brought up the idea that there needs to be more incentive for infill development. And that's one of the, options for incentives for that. But when I read this density bonuses to encourage development of current vacant infill, would it help to have more specific policy options for incentives that developers see as, that would help us with trying to address these issues? A little further than just saying, let's collaborate.
Well,
Or is there a way to tie some of these together to say, if you do this, it'll actually link to decreased greenhouse gas emissions. Because you might develop around transit hubs or.
So you're talking more about code, in my opinion, the level of code
Right.
than comp plan policy. And the other thing I would say, and I really appreciate that the Board of Realtors doesn't just say what the issues, they have put forth some ideas to address it. But I thought that the density bonuses are hard to get at because we sort of have a practice of giving developers the density they want anyway, right? We don't hold it down and say, now you gotta buy up, or now you gotta do some things to get up here. A lot of development is constrained naturally by parking. So unless you're doing an underground
Parking is natural.
parking garage, John has his views on cars and parking, we won't go there, but I'm just talking practically, what we're saying. What they do is they'll map out the property, right, and they'll say, okay, I can park this many cars, I can build to the setbacks here, I know I only wanna go up so many stories before I need an elevator, and it gets expensive building construction. So I need RM15 development, okay, that's what I'm gonna request, and if the comp plan supports it, it's fairly automatic, if it doesn't. So I'm a little bit stretched to know what incentives we can give, unless it's financial, which really gets almost immediately into the city commission bailiwick for
These incentives that were
discussion.
mentioned in here about preserving native woodlands, historically significant farmlands and structures.
Those are things we're gonna have to build regulation toward.
Okay, so is there, I mean, I don't know much about density bonuses, but I'm just curious, is there something that gets to this notion of incentives for infill development that is similar to how else you've used the word incentives throughout the document?
So I'll give you an example. A mixed-use zoning district is a good example of where we have a table of incentives. And the Here at Lawrence project, despite what your opinion might be about that project, from a planning perspective, is a very valuable project. It met a number of planning values, transit location, green roofs, Energy Star certified, a number of planning values, and received extra units because of it. And so that was an infill project that went along those lines. So those are the kind of things that we think of we can do with incentives, but they had to start in the code, right? But that all started from comp plan policies too, about mixed use. So I think it's an ongoing discussion. I don't want to.
The zoning variance one, I mean, how does that fit? I don't know if that either.
Well, zoning variances are things like, different parking regulations and different setbacks and different height. Well, that all has a state statute-based process, and zoning should be consistent for the most part. But what we're proposing, because that's what zoning does, is
That's what I'm looking
outline-
for, is when you are saying collaborate, I mean, there's not a lot of detail what that might mean. Like, is there a way to signal, yeah, some things were on the table that maybe weren't before? That, and maybe it's not decided today, but it's
Yeah.
just freeing up staff to
No, and I appreciate that,
figure that
because
out. So what would the
I think
collaborative approach look like?
I have thought that this will need some sort of framework if the policy gets approved, right? To help us understand what the expectations of the development community, the city, maybe others are. And maybe that's through administrative policy, or maybe it's through regulation later, but it all starts at this policy level to say, yes, we recognize there's a community benefit component to growing our city. The question to this group, I think, is, do you agree that annexations should have sort of this two-pronged test associated with it? Is it needed, and is there a benefit to the greater community? More than just growing is good, for the reasons we acknowledge. We don't say growing's not good, we acknowledge growing's good. In fact, we don't have much say in it, to be honest. We either grow or we don't, and we don't really say whether we grow or we don't. For the most part, KU and major employers and the people who come to live here decide whether Lawrence grows or not, or whether Douglas County grows or not. But when I think about what those generators of growth are, we can all kind of run through the list, right? Major employers and our quality of life.
I'm just concerned that even the discussion about annexation is missing the point. I mean, you're dancing around what incentives really are. I brought my box today because, we spent 4 years talking anecdotally about all of this stuff. But there's real research out there that addresses all of this. I recently came across, I wanted to research where this Board of Realtors thing was coming from. The National Association of Realtors had a report that's 13 years old that talks about the importance of infill density. And it was written in collaboration from the Environmental Protection Agency. And at the end of the day, what they're talking about is infill reduces carbon emissions, period. 7% in Arlington, Virginia, when they added density, 7% of the land area is producing 33% of the tax revenue in the urban core. We've been mandated from the public talking about economic development, or at least jobs, as being a primary goal. And we're seeing a paradigm shift in how employers are identifying how they're going to get talent, and it comes down to that quality of life. The core of the Lawrence is what's going to create, I think, the opportunity for employers to come here. The problem is we don't have enough affordable housing. That's a real big component for employers to look for a place to go. We've got, over and over again, I've said, 80 years of history of developing single-family housing. And so annexation on the edges is not really going to do much for our community. And we're not providing anything in this plan that I feel confident in that's really going to drive change to create infill development. And those changes specifically are upzoning neighborhoods, reducing, eliminating setbacks, allowing for cottage housing or ADUs, and eliminating parking requirements. This is my research. Study after study after study, city after city after city, adopting those policies, and it's not in our plan.
I can pinpoint where it's in our plan for you, specifically.
We have most incentives that are available to us that we have data on are illegal in Lawrence. I am the chair of the BZA. We deny requests to add density, to create infill development every single week or every single month. Really creative projects that could really help our community and reduce development in the rural areas or reduce the need for annexation. And because we're restricted by the 5 conditions that are mandated by the state, we have no wiggle room to allow the kind of zoning variances that they're asking for. And so I've argued this whole time, and I cannot really support this plan until it suggests we change our zoning policies.
So if you go to page 12, just up a little bit there, our growth management vision, right there. It starts with our vision is to manage growth in the city by capitalizing on infill opportunities and directing growth to new areas where infrastructure is planned, so on and so forth. It's a much stronger growth management statement than what we have. We've got policies to expand ADUs to all RS districts, for example, because we kept hearing about that. After last meeting, John, we revised the plan to put a much higher density development
we'll
in.
get into that.
We have a policy related to going back into sector plans. But I think it's not realistic to think that for the next 20 years, we're not going to need to expand the city boundaries and do everything on the very limited amounts of infill. We're not going to take down single-family neighborhoods and put up a bunch of high-rises. It's not the will of this
Nobody's
community.
suggesting that, and in fact, this report would show you dozens and dozens of examples that are no higher than 4 stories.
Well,
Townhomes, all kinds of housing products that we do not have available in this market that could be beautifully integrated to our community. Nobody's talking about high rises. You mentioned high density in here, 36 units an acre. That's not high density, that's medium density by most standards.
It was 32 plus.
That's 32 plus, that's medium
Plus
density.
goes all the way to the.
But by calling it very high density, you're already creating an environment where, when we get to policy making, when we get to the neighborhood discussions, neighborhoods are naturally gonna say, well, we don't want very high density in our neighborhood, that's scary, and I wanna reserve that comment. But, you know, there was just an article that came out about affordable housing project seeks to add small homes to existing neighborhoods here in Lawrence. So, 2 houses on a lot. This is what I've been talking about the whole time, which is what we should be doing. And your comments in here suggest the basic tenet of zoning is that code must be applied equitably and consistently. If we open the code up for that scenario for affordable housing, which we may be able to do, the challenge is, do we have to do that for everybody? And then you said, then you've really eroded what an RS district is meant to serve, which are single-family uses. And what I'm sensing from you and the policy that's coming from the planning department is a lack of investment in exploring what it means to change single-family zoning. And that's antithetical to everything that's out there from research. I've yet to see anybody propose to be any paper or research argument or math that shows providing parking benefits a community. And it's a core part of our development code, and it restricts development in our urban core.
I feel like we're playing this discussion over,
Yeah, over and over again. It's not, but so we just allowed an entire page of changes to the plan without much discussion, which I think are great. But for 4 years, we've been talking about this, and it's all been anecdotal. There hasn't been education to this board about why we need to be looking at these policies. And I sense from you that you're not interested in engaging in them. I've yet to see any research that puts your position into context when all the research is out there. And more importantly, I've asked to measure tax revenue. If we look at tax revenue in the urban core, if you look at tax revenue from the HERE project or on 8th Street or whatever's going on in New Hampshire, tax revenue per capita is incredible compared to what these annexations are going to provide. And then the infrastructure cost is absolutely insane when you compare it to the same infrastructure downtown. Now, there was a comment made last time that the infrastructure, you know, isn't that big of a difference in cost because the infrastructure is going to be much bigger. But the reality is I did some homework on it. The HERE project has an 8-inch sewer main to serve that building. So the 400 or 500 units, I don't know how many thousand people living in the building. The sewers require a new development when you can have a cul-de-sac with only 7 people living in it, an 8-inch sewer line. And we got to pump that sewage 4 miles, 3 miles, or whatever it is, versus downtown where it's just got to go down the street. We're talking about infrastructure costs that aren't 2 times cost or 3 times cost. They're on the order of magnitude 10, 11, 12 times cost.
I guess I'm not seeing what you don't think the plan does, because I think I think the plan supports a lot of what you have put forward, John.
So then why didn't you
But not
suggest,
everything.
why didn't you not suggest that the comprehensive plan is addressing this issue,
Which issue?
allowing this? Because this is illegal.
Well, first of all, that's a very much a code level issue that
Well, that's what I'm
we're
talking about.
working on right now.
That's what I'm talking about.
But I would submit that not only do we do a vast amount of research, we bring forth all of the years and decades worth of experience that Lawrence communities and neighborhoods have provided to us on where they sit on some of these things. So I think this plan is taking good incremental steps toward some very good values, but are we ready to jump to the things you're advocating for?
Yes.
No, we're not.
Yes. And
Well, we're
let me
not.
ask, I got a quick
I'm telling
question.
you,
Who
we're not.
here is under 40? Under 45?
Joe.
So we got one under 45, I'm 40. Okay, so my concern here is that this plan is to be integrated to, over the next 20, 25 years. When really the people that are going to be paying for the results of this plan are not represented at this table. The high income earners, the taxpayers that are really going to bear the burden of what the result of this plan is are not here. And so I'm passionate about this, and I've done my research for this because I see a big difference between what we're actually talking about and what's really happening at really a global level. And I have access to this data because of what I do for a job. We've got economists that I have access to that are trying to identify trends because they're investing billions, if not trillions of dollars in what those changes are. And the reality is young people are less apt to want single-family homes. They don't want to maintain properties. They want a more urban experience.
And we need to accommodate the whole range of housing.
Sure, but our entire policy, the zoning code that we have, which I'm very intimate with, is a traditional zoning code that is replicated across the country that does two things. It serves single-family housing in suburban development, and it serves the automobile. That's how the code is written. The code is written specifically for those two models.
I would interject
Yeah.
here that as our community, our city, our county changes, as the demographics change, as youth come here, I mean, there is nothing that has to be static about this. This is a starting point with the conflict.
I understand that.
And codes will change as our, as things progress. We have a lot that's already undergirding this new comp plan that's just in the early discussions within codes and zoning codes of the county. I'm sure you guys are working on policies. So I don't think we can condemn the entire new draft plan because it doesn't reach, our highest aspirations right now. It can evolve with us as we
Absolutely.
aspire to be more progressive in all the ways that Seattle is, or all the cities that are represented there. But
I'm not denying any of that. All I'm suggesting is that, and Charlie raises the point, is that the incentives really aren't there. And I want, the other thing is, from a city commission standpoint, is that we're regularly putting ourselves in a position where progressive projects have to come to you for tax abatement. But what if we lived in a world where the zoning and the parking restrictions and the setbacks were established so that those developers could make profitable projects that add density without having to come to you for tax abatement? Wouldn't that be great? I think that's what I'm trying to get to. And we have a really unique opportunity to do this here. And after 4 years, I feel like we're still missing this chance.
Is that something that's done through the plan, or is it done through more code?
We can
Policy
present what we
commission?
want to present, and this doesn't have enough teeth in it. And I want to get to that comment about the density thing that we've added in a minute. But what I'm relating to is what Charlie's suggesting, is that the Board of Realtors is suggesting some incentives, and Charlie's alluding to the fact that the incentives aren't really in this plan.
Well, I'm really just trying to clarify, like, it seems like sometimes the remark is, well, that's a code thing, not a plan thing. And I see the word incentive in here several times, and there's not clarification for me, like, how that's a plan thing and not a code thing. So that feels like it's a code thing when it doesn't want to be addressed.
And maybe,
And I,
yeah.
It's a policy too, it's a
Yeah.
policy.
Yeah, so I think-
Policy.
that's what I was trying to get at the very beginning when this started, is that there are some things this group can't address, the planning commission can't address, the city commission can address incentives and the philosophy behind how we encourage development and all of that. I think that you're getting into areas that are specifically the challenge of policy making for a city commission that then directs the BZA's work. And so I want to be realistic about what we can accomplish here today in terms of the goal of passing out of this meeting the decision that we're ready to move this draft comp plan on to public meetings finally.
That's why I'm just reiterating that I don't disagree with where they're coming from. What I fear is that we are doing a great job of preserving the things that we want to preserve, but not providing anywhere in the plan to relieve the pressure on what we have.
Can I make one comment to this? Because we added a part to the implementation section here. Because I think there's been a lot of discussion throughout this. Well, how are we going to implement this? When are we going to get the regs? This kind of stuff. I wanted to point out that The planning commission, board of county commissioners, and city commission will prioritize the action items as they deem appropriate. So how we envision this plan moving forward over the years is that the highest priority, because we only have so many resources, right? We go each year to the governing bodies and the planning commission and say, what do you see as the priorities for us to work on? Stream buffer ordinances, density issues, we're working on sector plans, working on zoning regs. I mean, this is how we implement the plan over time. So this implementation section is both a way to get work items on a work plan and to track them over time. So just want to clarify that component of it. And John, I can see that different policies will be interpreted differently throughout the years also about how we go to work on some of these things.
Well, what I'm getting at is the biggest implementation tools that are available are not there. And there's a mountain of research that talks about what those implementation tools are. And they're not in our plan. It's simple. Upzone, setbacks, parking. And you have admitted to it. The biggest thing I run across in the BZA is so many uses are not allowed. I'm not even getting into the fact that we have zoning based on use.
And we haven't, my staff and I have intentionally not recommended some of the things that your data shows.
John, does the plan, in your eyes, prevent those things from happening, or it just doesn't include them specifically?
So we're in a situation where the difference between what the general public understands about development and what neighbors understand about development, and what is actually, what the data shows and what examples have shown is positive for neighborhoods are antithetical to each other. And that leads to a political environment where if we do not have the core of what I'm talking about in this plan, then my fear is that governing bodies will not have the fortitude or the conviction to be able to stand up to what I call NIMBYism, which is not my backyard. And because of that, my concern is that we'll just continue down this cycle where we've just talked, about ethereal ideas about what would be great for our community, but nothing ever actually gets implemented because it gets watered down at the community level in environments where we have anecdotal evidence told by individuals that leads to decision-making rather than looking at the data. And I feel like we could provide the framework for the data to show that you should have conviction when it comes to initiating policy, which is being able to stand up to folks and suggest that we should not be subsidizing parking. Imagine that we live in a community where we subsidize free parking all over the place, both on the city level and the private level, but we don't have money for sidewalks, for pedestrians, and we don't have money for bike lanes. That's flipped upside down relative to what we've talked about here. But there's no meat in here, there's no teeth in here to give conviction to the next governing bodies to be able to stand up.
So it sounds like your answer to my question was that no, there is nothing in the plan that prevents those things from happening. You want it to be ensured of happening by codifying it in the plan.
I want to at least give it a fighting chance.
Is that the work of the plan to do, or is that the work of our community to do to bring those ideas forward?
I would argue if we're drafting a plan here, this is the opportunity to do it. That's where we are. If we have the appendix in here with the action items. If we have action items in here, then why are we not putting them there?
I would argue that we're not ready to put these actions in our plan. I think we're ready for the discussion, and I think we've set it out in the plan, the community discussion beyond this group. I come from a small lot neighborhood, and we have a lot of young families there. So I haven't heard from them that they want to have more density in our neighborhood. I can't speak for those families.
Sure.
But if they do, then we'll hear more of that discussion in the future
Yeah.
from the young people in our community.
I regularly get from peers. We cannot find anything. We want to live in your neighborhoods, but we cannot find anything. Would you live in multifamily? Absolutely. It's not available. And now I'm hearing it from older folks.
I think we have a very tight housing issue.
It's getting
very
expensive.
difficult for folks. Not only expensive, but just limited offerings all around. Not an issue we're gonna solve today. I would agree with Lisa in terms of these are conversations that need to be had in the public. This plan, this draft plan can spur that conversation.
I hope so.
I think it will, and you can certainly present your concerns to the planning commission when it comes to the planning commission to help spur that.
So is there going to be, if we were to adopt this, is there going to be an education session with the planning commission and with the city commission to suggest this is the opportunity for those groups to add implementation items to the plan?
Well, they would add policies, and then the governing bodies and planning commission decide which policy to pursue, if it's a change to how we're doing things. See what I mean?
Is a policy an action item?
It can become one. If it's not something that, if it's something that needs a code change to it, then yes, it's an action item. And so we've chosen a number of them for our implementation, but it's not the end all. Again, each year, we can determine what that work plan is and move on. Each year, the other thing that we're required by statute to do is put the comp plan against evolving trends in the community. So it may be that we're at a point in 10 years, that the automobile's at a point in 10 years, that we need to rethink a lot of our automobile policies. And I would argue that if you look back 10 years ago to where we are today, and the multimodal component of our transportation planning is 100% better than where we were at. It's because the whole world is evolving on that, and because the local community has evolved. So this will not be the same plan we end up with in 15 years, if we're doing it right. If each year we're looking at it and putting the comp plan to the test of the changing world around us.
So what is the mechanism that the planning commission and the city commission is going to have to understand how those action items work?
Well, they'll be presented through this process of adoption.
And so are there a number of policies, because you suggested that you specifically left some of the things that I've been talking out. Is there an intention from your staff to educate the planning commission and the city commission on what some of those policies might be, based on the discussions that we've had here?
We're going to present the plan, and then the rest of the community can present their ideas and notions to the plan. So I'm not going to go individually and present issues that each individual member had or individual podium speakers. So we're going to present the majority consensus recommendation of this group to those three bodies.
And how have you measured majorities of consensus since we started the
It's a
process?
vote that you'll take here any moment now.
Well, within a half an hour, we're gonna have a vote to do that. And I would suggest that community members, people who have specific expertise and concerns, who see gaps or new ideas that haven't been incorporated in this plan, the time for those, the big ideas, the big shifts, the changes in attitude for, about parking or bike paths and all of that. That's Michael Allman's here. He's someone who continually brings ideas forward that every now and then, turns into a policy change. Or Penny and the environmental groups. That's how these, kind of extra layers of progressive ideas can be added in through the public process and the vetting of the ideas, and then what that policy impact would be. And a lot of this would be city commission conversation in terms of
I would
changes.
share some of the process that we've just seen recently on planning commission. We just approved 3 text amendments,
Mhm.
right? those are things that are being brought forward either by staff because they're seeing them happening, or the request to have them happen over and over again in the community, like RS5 zone, let me get the number right there, Scott, the smaller lot size, is that right? RS5 zoning was something that was probably not a strategy in Horizon 2020, but became a strategy in between, was brought to the planning commission to look at and as a text amendment. I mean, the plan is constantly evolving. We need people like you to come to the planning commission and say, these are things that you need to keep thinking about. But I agree that I think there are always those early adopters who want those things forced, you know, who want that thing pushed, that we all need to come getting pulled along. Changes in our community are made by the bulk of our community, and that I know you know the bell, right? You know, there will also be those who, on some of the things that the whole community agrees on, well, not the whole community, nobody agrees on everything, but the bulk of the community agrees on, they're gonna be dragging their heels the whole way. I mean, that, to me, that's part of the process. I like this, that it sort of outlines some steps that we might take and encourages the public to continue to push on those things. I don't disagree with you, John, on parking. We've had this conversation a lot. I don't disagree with you on density. We've had that conversation. But I agree. I think we've got to let the community absorb it. And I think, you know, you're certainly a champion of this, and I appreciate that and respect that and hope you will continue to be that.
You have to recognize that I'm looking at it from the lens of the chair of the BZA, where I regularly vote against what I know is right for our community, but is what is right for the BCA based on the restrictions that I have.
And that's another way that text amendments get started, is somebody noticing that this is a problem, it's been a problem in these situations, and then you bring it forward to the appropriate staff that can address that, and it goes through the process and then comes to the board that needs to talk about it.
I understand that in 5 years in the BZA, we're still battling the same issue over and over. And we have the meat here to do something about it, and I see an article in the paper that suggests there is an intention to do anything about it. I don't tend to
Don't believe everything you read in the paper,
Yeah.
first of all.
So, I'd like to address the 88U issue and the parking issue.
Yeah.
And Scott had mentioned this, but it might help just to see it. I don't know if you have it in front of you, but, you know, page 20, we have 6.3 clearly confirms what Scott said, expand opportunities to create accessory dwelling units in all Lawrence RS zoning districts.
I know that's there. That's a great
So, it's not current policy, because this plan hasn't been adopted, right? So, to address the article, there isn't current policy to do that. I think Scott's really just reflecting that. This plan would create the opportunity for that to happen. And then the next page, 7.10, adopt advanced parking strategies in transit-served areas and for compact mixed-use developments. That seems like a placeholder for the opportunity for changing how parking is required or not required.
I don't know so, but
There's nothing about setbacks in here that I can find, but of the three things you mentioned, two of them seem like they have actually been addressed.
And I would add, the reason we're doing a major, almost a new plan, really, we started off thinking, Horizon 2020 is working for us, we'll just tweak it. So much has changed in the world, right, about multimodal development and affordable housing and the economy, that we had to go through the issue action report first to understand what issues we wanted to work on. So remember, this was all based on that whole process. But I tend to agree with Patrick that, John, you're very much an early adapter of things, and we need to let the community chew on some of these things if we're to make real progress in time, over time.
It's hard to remember, but we started this talking about the Board of Realtors letter.
Exactly.
So, just was wanting to try to close down like the path we've been on with you. If that's okay. And then go back to that question, which I think, Scott, you put out, right now, there's kind of recognizing the need and then the community benefit.
Mhm.
And you were asking us something, and I feel like it's kind of been lost. So what was the, I don't mean to cut you off either, but.
Well, I was
I feel like we
asking,
gotta reel it back to what was the question?
Sure.
And
I was
how do
asking
we-
if you thought the policies in the plan reflected that the community benefit is intended to be a collaboration between partners, mostly the city and the development community. Because I think that was our intention, but I'm not sure it
It's communicated.
reads that way. And when I receive letters like this, I'm pretty sure it doesn't read that way, because the concern is you're asking us to shoulder everything. And why are you asking us to provide the community benefit?
Scott, how do you think that it shows that you're recommending collaboration?
Well, I think what I'm asking for is if you agree that you give us direction to add a policy or two that modifies the whole idea and give us more ability to wordsmith and reflect that it's really a collaboration. Because we've talked about annexation and growth should be good for all parties. But then I think it reads a little too much like the development party is the one that's going to provide all the benefit. Well, it's not really the intention. We got to work through whatever the benefit is. Again, I don't know what that looks like, but I think it could use a little bit more support on that end of it as we kick it off into the community discussion. I have no idea that will, satisfy anybody in the community, but I think that's the intention that we've had from staff anyway, that we're asking you about tonight, is if you agree, then we will include that in the next draft that goes out to the community.
So I would very much agree with that it probably needs to be spelled out a little more specifically, because when I read it, I know how things kind of operate and that there are a lot of give and takes. As before an item comes to us at the planning commission, I really like to see that staff and the developer have worked together to resolve some issues before it came to us, and that there are some give and takes, and it's collaborative. But you're right, it really isn't spelled out in the document that is the intention. And so it would be easy to, and there's always a fear when you're a developer coming with a project to the city about how will it be received, to kind of clarify what can or can't be offered and what that collaboration might look like.
Sure.
I would say having the idea of a community benefit when we talk about annexation is, I think, very helpful to our discussion, and because there have been not a lot of projects that came forward for annexation. I guess I remember having one, I can't remember specifically what it was, where we thought, we don't really have anything behind us in the current plan, which is Horizon 2020, to deny it, but we weren't crazy about it. But that was kind of the end of the discussion, because we didn't have that in the plan. But be able to say, not so that we can deny more things, but so that we can really kind of fully understand what's the benefit, what's happening with that annexation, what comes along with it. So I like the idea of that two-pronged approach, but you're right, I think it does need to be clarified. And even that there is, I guess that goes to the city commission, but that there is a pool of money being generated for affordable housing that hasn't been exactly decided how that would be used, but that it's not intended to be just a burden put on an industry.
Scott, when I read 3.8, which is on page 24, I believe, or maybe 14, depending on how you read these pages, it says annexation requests shall identify the community benefit. To me, that language puts the responsibility on the developer to identify the benefit. Is that what you're asking? I think that's what
part
you're
of it,
at-
I think.
Yeah, is how we adjust that language.
But
so
that's
it's a-
part of it, and then addressing the community benefit is the other part.
Right, which is earlier up, isn't it?
I mean, if you go back up to page 13, that main paragraph, proposed annexations, there might be an opportunity in that last sentence of that paragraph to inject more of a tone of collaboration and partnership that I've heard here. For example, you could change that last sentence to read, the financial considerations for providing and maintaining infrastructure and services to a new area should be a collaborative effort or venture or something. to avoid placing an additional burden on existing municipal residents, period. And I mean,
Yeah.
collaboration
It's-
and partnerships in there anyway, but that would inject that tone earlier on.
No, I agree, that's the kind of thing we were looking for.
What is an example burden of existing municipal residents? What are we talking about? Future infrastructure costs?
Right,
Okay. So,
maintenance,
And maintenance.
government services, number of things.
Is this something where we could, just getting sensitive to the time here, is this something where we can have a consensus that we would just direct staff to create something
Something along the
like
lines, yeah.
what was just suggested, but that fits within the, appropriate.
That's what we would
planning
request.
So,
I would make such a motion if you'd like.
thank you.
I would move that we allow staff some latitude to wordsmith a little bit in this section about the collaborative nature of community benefit.
We have a motion, is there a second?
And that would be throughout the document, not just this one place
It could be throughout the document as needed.
as needed.
A second. Been moved and seconded, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, we have just a few, about 15 minutes or so, left before we go ahead and make a final, maybe, would this be our last vote?
Yes.
We think
Because
it would
when,
be.
when all is said and done with this, when this goes through planning and city and county and it's adopted, I mean, it's out there. Once it leaves today, it's out there, right? It's not coming back to us.
We do not foresee it coming back unless something drastic happens.
Okay. And you
I'm
will,
not thinking about that.
you will shepherd this along so that nothing drastic
Yes.
happens, right?
Of course.
You had mentioned, you envisioned having a kickoff meeting joint for planning and the governing bodies.
Right.
Is that a meeting to which you would also envision that we could be invited to as observers?
Oh, yeah, it would be an
To
open
see how
public
it's
meeting,
positioned,
absolutely,
and then it formally goes through the planning and.
correct.
But I think specifically to
Oh, yeah.
ask the steering committee, whoever would want to attend to, yeah.
Right, you gotta keep us honest and to the, that we're representing your plan that came out of this committee.
So are there any other comments?
I have kind of a general comment, and I think it addresses why a lot of the people in the audience are here today also, is that in my mind, moving forward with this document just brings it to the next level where I would expect people who have a stakehold in what we're talking about here will come and inform us as the planning commission, who many of which will not have heard a lot of this discussion before. It'll be a fresh discussion, and it'll be important to bring forward a lot of the items that we've heard about, and some that many that we haven't heard about. And even if this document comes to be adopted, there's a lot more work that comes after that. What we've put is placeholders in here. There are a lot of, especially about the sensitive lands, about wetlands and floodplains, floodways. There's a lot of discussions that will have to come after this is adopted. And it's kind of up to the community to keep us, to make sure that that happens in a timely manner for the things that are important to people. And the housing discussion will be another big one, that we put the placeholders in here, and then we need to put teeth behind that within those action items. And the ag land preservation, which is just a very new topic that I'm glad to have a placeholder in here. I know we won't solve that before this passes, and there's no need for us to. But just, for the community to recognize that this is the beginning of a work, not so much the end of a work.
And thank you for that, because it's an important kind of nagging thing, and I suspect that's true for folks who are here specifically for the environmental issues, the loss of Chapter 16 in favor of what's in the new comp plan, which is much less detailed, much more, it's not pointing yet to all of those, very specific things that used to be. What happens in the gap between the adoption of this plan and the time it takes to do new policies, do a sector plan, do the kind of work that gets at specific issues, and we're not there yet, but something comes up that challenges us because we don't have the language in here, the detailed language, and we don't have, does that commission get to reference the previous plan that had the details, that had the, I mean, how do we inform that conversation when we don't have the deeper details yet?
Well, we can inform in a number of different ways, and sometimes planning commissioners help inform the conversation with what they know, or previous planning commissioners do. So I'm not concerned that all the perspectives will be out there. And I think, though, it's usually about putting all the information in a report and letting the decision makers see all that's there. I think we'll try to use the intent of of the latest adopted plan for the most part, but each issue may be very case specific. Not an easy question or
No.
answer.
Well, and especially when I think of, like, 4 years later, we just
Right.
identified that the UGA around Grant Township is gonna change. I mean, that is very concerning for folks who, as things come along, who have very specific concerns, and we don't know how long it will be before they really are in black and white on policy in the next deeper.
I would say that's why each year,
Yeah.
the bodies who should have their finger on the pulse of the community and what they are hearing and what we bring them, what we're hearing, sets that work plan. So the idea is to hit the highest priority issues first, of course.
Right.
When you look in your crystal ball, when do you think, or when would you like to see this plan go before the governing bodies? Not the planning commission, but the governing bodies.
I would hope that this is a winter work plan, that we get in front of the joint presentation within 2 or 3 months, hopefully, fall for sure, and then we roll it out, and it's just a matter of putting it on the agenda, and I cannot foresee how many meetings it might take of the planning commission to pass it through the planning commission, for example, but I mean, I would tell you what's something that's typical about a process like this is that there are gonna be perceived winners and losers. And the winners at the planning commission, well, usually the losers at one body will make a play to the next body, and then make a play to the next body. And that's how we end up in a cycle of revolving around the different decision makers with the plan. So I just put that caveat out there and maybe a little forewarning to those individuals who sit on those bodies now that, and that's kind of a natural way that these things get processed, but that's the best way I can answer that, Bill.
Okay.
Is that process need to play out like that, or is it just, like, I'm curious when you mentioned that you bring everyone together for the kickoff,
This is a small entry in the plan, but I believe it is one of the most critical. And this goes back to what I was mentioning earlier about the potential political issues with this. And my concern is my expectation was that those figures were going to change. That as far as what measures medium density. But what I see here is that we've added very high. And that very high is really a charged term. And I'm certain that if it came to BZA or the planning commission, there'd be residents that would be very, very concerned if
I would
anything proposed
yeah.
that was very high density.
John, we gave this a lot of discussion and thought, and there's a lot of already existing plans and code based on this table as it stands today, so it was difficult for us to completely change it without a tremendous amount of work on the backside and have that gap from policy to regulation. And I think you're trying to use it in maybe infill situations, which we can, but we saw it, and the reason the policy talks about revising sector plans, which are usually the plans that are growth to come, right, development to come, that we would alter the appropriate plans, sector plans, to accommodate the very high density category.
Okay, well, I'm gonna pass this around real quickly. This is from the California Institute of Housing that talks about what density looks like, and it'll give you a density figure next to the photo. I'm gonna pass these around.
And by the way, we also have work to do in the zoning code itself,
Right.
because it's capped at 32 units per acre. So we're going to have to raise the limit in the MU district.
Yeah, these are different projects. I wanna pass these on real quick. These are different projects, so there's a picture. So here's a, yeah, here's a two-story building, and then it'll show you the density.
Okay.
So, this particular one has 54 units per acre, and it's a two-story building with 12,000 square feet of retail. To me, that's not very high density, 2 stories. This particular development is 12 units per acre, which is cottages. And we call that medium. And I'm looking at this looks like low density to me. So my concern is that we're projecting to the public a level of density that may not be accurate. To me, very high density is a high rise. And many of these projects that you see here would qualify as very high density, and they don't look like high rises. I mean, we're talking about 2-story buildings. And so my concern is that when we go down this path of explaining what infill development can be, we're already setting ourselves up for political issues, because people will be concerned when they see a very high density proposal or a high density proposal. They're thinking 12-story building. They're not looking at cottages or a 2-story building. And this is the one thing that I see as a real opportunity to change public perception about what density means. And so you can see all these density examples. Those don't look like very big buildings to me, and they would be classified as very high in almost all cases.
Oh.
If we change that wording very high to urban, would that satisfy? Would that give people a different connotation?
I think it would help, but I think there's a real issue with the numbers as well, because almost all single family, I believe, falls into low or very low, very low. And so, I'm also wondering about the figures.
What do you mean all single family falls into very low?
A 50 by 117 lot is gonna fall into low or very low.
It's 1 to 6 per acre in the low.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So, I feel like it's kind of skewed. That whole chart is skewed to the lower end, projecting that.
And again, we didn't think,
Yeah.
we
So
were in
where
the
does that
position.
come, where does that come from? What science or data is
Well,
that chart based on?
it comes from Horizon 2020. I don't know if it
Mhm.
came from Plan 95 before that.
Right.
But I will also say I mean, we talk about the experience of the community and the community's desire. The regulations are, a mixture of a lot of community input, John. So you have to keep that in mind, that experience has to count for something when we talk about parking and density and heights of buildings. That's all based on experience of what Lawrence as a community, through a series of projects, have informed us what their appetite is on each one of those issues. So that's how you might say chicken or egg. Well, is that because that's what we require and our policies are? Or is that what they're really asking for? I would argue that's what they're really asking for, because we test that a number of ways, a number of times throughout the years.
Right, and that I don't disagree with that, but the basis, the beginning of those policies comes from very dubious math. And that's what led us to a position where the average cost of a housing unit has far exceeded typical inflation over the last 100 years. So are we gonna take a stance to start to correct some of that, or are we gonna continue down this path of relying on, what you're talking about, experience of what people want, but it's all started from a place that is very dubious in its nature, really has some really dangerous roots that include segregation and racism.
I wanted to make sure that you saw that we were paying attention to
Yeah,
the comments.
I did.
We put a couple policies that helped us
Yep.
go toward that.
Yep.
I don't think we're ready to overhaul our entire zoning system for it. You will disagree, you may
Yep.
desire that. We put the density chart in the appendix to show how the density has changed for the community over time. And that's all I have to say about that.
Well,
And-
urban would help.
I'm gonna
It's
say
improvement.
that I think that this conversation is gonna have to wait till you bring it before the planning commission or the city commission, and that we work with those pretty serious charges, in the public, sphere, and watch this plan change as time goes along. And say that we are like 4 minutes away. Do we have any other people coming in for me? I want to make sure that we do get to the end of our meeting on time.
Well, I'm just curious, am I crazy when you look at those projects? Do those look like very high density to you?
No, they look great. They look great.
Well, I didn't ask if they look great. I mean, great, I mean.
They don't look like high rises. I'm just saying, we are at the end of a 4 frickin' year long process here. And I think it's time to take, most of all, you know what? It's time to thank our staff. Jeff, you've done incredible work authoring this and working through the stats, and Amy and other staff who is here. Scott, for leading us through 2 more years of a project than you expected into a 4-year. Well, I mean, it's been a long haul, and folks who were here from the very beginning, it's a lot of time, a lot of effort, and folks who came in late in the game, who still added important voices and ideas. And I'm sorry that some folks are gonna walk away from this feeling like we have not done our job to the fullest, and others probably wish we had done our job a little less and released it a long time ago. So somewhere, and Scott Zaremba is out there somewhere.
Tulsa.
Tulsa. Yeah.
February
Tulsa.
10th, 2014 was our first.
I know.
I would just like to add, this being so late to the game on this, that, again, thanks for all the work, but I think it actually closes on the fact that this really is almost just the beginning. I mean, the group has put together a product, and that as we move it on, that it is the beginning of the next phase. And I think that says a lot.
And I think it's a perfect moment. I would like to see a motion on number 5, if that would be possible.
And that's the last act. I would entertain a motion to, from this steering committee to submit the revised draft plan to the Lawrence Douglas County Metropolitan Planning Commission and consequently the governing bodies.
Would it be appropriate for me to make that motion, seeing as I'm also the recipient of it?
Yeah.
Sure.
I would make a motion that this draft be submitted to the planning commission for consideration and for public process
In the governing body, yeah.
and so forth. That was me, sorry. I made the motion that this draft be presented to the planning commission and the governing bodies for the public process that comes after.
With the changes.
With the changes we motioned earlier.
Ditto, all the changes mentioned previous in
Got
this
it.
meeting.
All right, we've got our motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed?
Nay.
All right, there we go.
Nancy, I know that you also wanted to thank the public that have been involved for a very long time. You mentioned that to me, and the future public that we're going to participate in this process. The community's been great so far, and they'll be just as good as we go through a very civil process of landing on our policy in the comp plan. And we thank you all for your time and efforts into it. It's been a very good process so far. I look forward to the beginning of the end.
And you'll let us know when that kickoff is.
Yeah. It is.